Milton Shinberg. Welcome to the Neuroarchitect.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Please tell us more about your career path and the motivations behind your focus on people centered architecture.
I've found after teaching for 50 years and working as an architect for 50 years that much of what architects do doesn't really get to the heart and the soul and the spirit and the feeling of people. And so I wondered all along that time what we could do better. And what I found, almost by accident, really by accident, was some books that started to open my mind to how psychology and neuroscience could give us answers, ways to think, ways to investigate, ways to propose, and ways to test whether what we're proposing makes any sense at all. So, over the period of time that I've taught a course called Beauty and Brains for 30 years at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And that course encapsulates much of what I've learned. And I find my students very excited to think about architecture in a neuroarchitectural way. Very excited.
I would like to know more about when you were a student. What did you find? What did you learn? And how you thought of or developed your ways of designing and looking at architecture?
I was very fortunate to have a very good architectural education. I went to Carnegie Mellon University, and I had teachers who were typical traditional architecture teachers, but I also had one, Raymond Gendros, who did a study of an Italian hill town. And when he presented that, and when I worked with him as my studio teacher, I suddenly realized that there are lots of ways to think about architecture and not just the traditional ways that most schools and my school did. So my experience as a student was I had a foundation that's not unusual for architects, quite typical, I would think. But built on top of that was curiosity, and a deep curiosity to find out why things are the way they are and not just what they are.
How are beauty and neuroscience linked to architectural design?
They're profoundly connected. I would say beauty is sometimes used in the same way that sometimes people use the word pretty. It's nice
Mm.
to look at, but beauty is much deeper than that. There are two media that people do as a creative process that I think get to the depth of beauty in a very, very unconscious but profound way. Music is one, and architecture is the other. In the case of both of them, our unconscious selves respond with our whole selves, with our whole spirit, our whole heart, our whole selves. I think there's something about what happens that is not in words, that goes below words, that gets to who we really are. And music and architecture together and separately have those capacities. So for me, beauty is almost like the bellwether, the bell that rings when you are experiencing something deeply. Beauty doesn't always mean pretty. Sometimes it is powerful. Sometimes it could even be ugly. But it really means that there are things in the environment that are deeply connected to who you are.
You mentioned music and architecture. And the research findings say that the brain processes music and architecture almost the same way, in the sense that when we sit in a place, the design affects our taste in music, even music when it comes to our voice tone. It changes, like even the accent we choose or the language we choose to speak with in a certain designed place affect us because it affects the same areas in the brain.
And that makes sense because both of them are tied to movement and your whole embodied sense. So music and architecture both have movement, cadence, tempo, and something I think is most profound for both, which is what is called tension. So
Mm.
in musical tension, a theme starts up, it pauses, it's not resolved, you feel uncomfortable, and then it moves toward resolution. Architecture is a little bit different because it's three-dimensional and you can move through it in different ways. It's not as temporally structured as music, but it still has sense of tension and a sense of, I think something's going to happen, and then finding it, and there's a sense of resolution. Sometimes it's just taking the major figure and putting it in front of the center of your cone of vision. But both of them involve the embodied sensation. So I think architecture and music both get processed through the parts of your brain that control movement.
Mm. Also, when it comes to beauty, so beauty can mainly mean security, familiarity. So it's not just like this wow that we get this impression when we see something maybe bigger than our uh, human centered proportions, let's say. We feel that something makes us feel good for some reason and we don't know why. But we know why as architects and designers in this field.
I think if you think about the word awe, that plays into it. There are some things that are bigger than us, as you say, more majestic than us, that capture us, and we are sometimes just stunned by by that kind of engagement. You go into Hagia Sophia, for example.
Mm,
What would your reaction be? Or to Notre Dame? When you go into places like that, you sense a deep, deep, deep stillness underneath them. There may be people talking, there may be things going on, but what you really feel is what comes up from the ground into you, that sense of stillness and majesty. I think awe is an important component. It's not always part of beauty. Beauty can be very soft. Beauty can be very low scale, looking at a flower, for example, but it can also be majestic, like a mountain.
mm. But you mentioned two examples that make me think of also that we find a place beautiful because of inherited narratives. So you're talking about Notre Dame, you're talking about Hagia Sophia. So these are two places that also people with a certain religious background or cultural background carry the emotions of the older generations with it.
Mhm. Do you think, I'll ask a question back, we can discuss it. Do you think
Yeah.
that there are universals that people, regardless of culture, regardless of history or background, would be moved by? For instance, people travel thousands of miles to go to the Acropolis to see the Parthenon, to stand there, or to go to Hagia Sophia for that matter, or go to any number of places, the Imperial Palace. You can just cite enormous numbers of people going to great difficulty and great expense to go to places. And I suspect that there, in the case of beauty, but also all sorts of architectural qualities, that they are part of what is hardwired in us. It's not necessarily what happened in the last 50 years or the last 100 or 150 years. I think we're born with sensibilities that react to and engage with places that have deep beauty. I think we're wired for it.
Mm. Exactly. We are wired for certain proportions found in nature because we're species of survival. So we inherited the proportions of safety and of, danger. So, and it's related to nature, to natural proportions and fractals. But also, now also you mentioned something else about the Acropolis. So as a Lebanese, we have Baalbek, which is called also Heliopolis. It's also a place that looks like the Acropolis and the temples it has. It's a complex of temples. It has also the temple of Bacchus, the only temple of Bacchus, the god of wine. So if I, as a Lebanese, for example, go to the Acropolis, which I did, the first thing I would do is to compare what I have in my culture and this place. So
Right.
this notion also of beauty is related to comparative, the experience and the comparison of what we know.
I think that's right. I think that's right. So I'm here in Washington, D.C., and it just happens that I was born and grew up in Washington, D.C. My favorite building here is the Lincoln Memorial, which is in some ways related to the Parthenon. It has some of the same characteristics. But inside the building is a statue of Abraham Lincoln.
Mm,
The meaning for Americans of that person, that president, and what he did and the stresses that he experienced and what he was able to achieve and suffer through are majestic. And so when you see the majesty of the architecture and you see this super scale sculpture, it becomes part of what you respond to. I agree. I think your personal background, maybe it's enhancing, but it's certainly promoting a deep connection. When I was a teenager and a troubled teenager, which is redundant, all teenagers are troubled. I used to get in my little car in the night and I would drive down to the Lincoln Memorial and sit on the steps and look out over the city, and it would calm me and it would give me a sense of connection to things that were beyond my current moment. I thought that was embedded in me as one of the reasons I think I became an architect.
And I believe people with like enhanced sensitivity to these uh, topics like history, to where we come from, to how we inherit, our feelings and emotions and what we see around us also affect
Yes.
this experience with even new spaces that we didn't see before, and even new to our sense of space. Let's say, for example, if someone, let's say me, I go to see the pyramids are not very familiar to my culture. So we have some that were very small, not as much as the one of Giza, for example.
Right. Well, I've been there. I've had an experience, but my first experience in the pyramids was seeing it out the window of a tourist bus on the way to a hotel. And suddenly, instead of seeing a palm tree or a store that sold food, there were the pyramids, majestic,
Mhm,
off in
mhm,
the distance, but almost like cartoons because we were not close. But when you get off the path and walk up to them, again, you feel that sense of not just majesty, but impossibility. How could these things exist? I want to go back to your sense of personal connection, though. I think that you mentioned new space and personal connection, and that's kind of a conundrum. How can you respond as deeply to something that you've never seen before as to compared to something that you're familiar with? I think this goes to this underlying hardwired sense of things. And one of the things that architects are not very good at is trying to identify what are the profound underlying things. I like to use the word capital A architecture and that everything else is little a architecture. So, architecture are these profound things that we can utilize in any project. But then there is Greek architecture or Lebanese architecture or Eskimo architecture. It could be any number of things, which are the little a's. I think if architects can hit the capital A in their designs, then the little a's enrich, but it's a proposition worth exploring whether you can just do the little A's, the ones that are the most personal, and make majestic, profound architecture out of them. That's a test I would love to do. And for me, there's a metric. When I go to a place that really does hit me as a person, I feel something and it usually stops me and I usually pause. And if someone was following me around with a stopwatch and noticed how long I've paused, or how long you paused, or how long someone who's not an architect pauses, I think you would have a metric of how much we are reacting to beauty.
mhm. Also, this highlights the importance of what we provide to our children to grow a sense of proportions, of discovering materials, understanding the spaces in front of them. So the more items you give them to touch, the more you give them the freedom to go in nature and discover. You expose them to different kinds of architectures and design. They will learn also. So you're telling me if I go to a new place, I will use this background that I already have from these different experiences and put them all together into a very harmonized puzzle.
Right. And that's right. And so when you have kids around and you do help them have experiences, you can just see that they're enriched and you can see how it changes them. And I have a laboratory here in my house. I have a 3.5-year-old granddaughter who lives with us, who just built a city out of blocks yesterday
Mm,
and puts things together that are highly architectural. And she's 3.5. Yesterday, we went downtown in DC to a museum called the Air and Space Museum that has, full size planes hung from the roof. Um, she responds to these places as I think adults do, but you can see that more dramatically in the way a kid turns and a kid runs towards something and a kid stops and pauses. Adults, I think we see so much that we become kind of habituated to what's around us and we don't pay attention. But with people who are younger, shorter, you can see it more obviously. And I expect that she will be somebody who continues to draw and continues to make buildings out of blocks. And who knows, maybe she'll be an architect.
mm. And the most important thing is that when we see children using their imagination, not to stop them from using it to create spaces, to create a story. to create a song. So not to laugh at it because we never know what this sense of imagination that we feed in them will end up when they become adults.
It happens in my work as an educator that this has come up in a very strong way. When I've taught freshmen, first year students in architecture, I find that there are two ways to approach them, and I've found only one makes sense to me. The two ways are treat students as a blank slate that they know nothing. And the other one says, no, hold on. They have 17 or 18 or 19 years of experience with the built environment. They've already had that experience. What they lack is the ability to make it conscious, to be able to articulate it. So, what I have them do in the first month of the course is to start using words and to start to articulate and break down what it is that they're experiencing with adjectives that have emotional weight to them, and to do drawings, no matter how crude. It doesn't matter, make any difference at all whether the drawings are elegant or not, but to start to externalize what they can't articulate. Just putting it on paper gives them a chance to see it objectively outside themselves, to describe it and to analyze it, and then later in architecture to be able to manipulate those forms. But the notion of education for young architects is treating them as a blank slate, to treat them all alike, rips away what you and I are talking about, which is the personal connection. That's what we ultimately build as architects, is our personal connection to what the world can be as a built experience.
Mm.
So I start by saying I want to emphasize your agency and your individuality, not just that you're an architect like any other architect. You are a specific person who wants to be an architect.
You reminded me of my experience when I was teaching also. Uh, there is a course where I told them, okay, so you have many choices to give me the result, depending on your talents. Show me, for example, something you did like creative work related to a period in architecture. For other people, show me a research and do a presentation. For other people, memorize something and say it for me. So I tried to include different ways, and the students were very excited to present because it's their talent, and they were happy to show their talent through this work. And at the same time, they learned from each other different ways of looking at how we can submit a work in different ways. So there are different perspectives at looking at the same subject. And also, I gave them a role play in professional practice. I gave them to do a role play where someone is the client, the other is the architect, and they start to show, for example, the client, so the student who is the client, started mm, like giving opinions or saying unexpected things to the other who is the architect, the other student playing the architect, and the architect was providing these solutions. So also this problem solving in a playful way helped them a lot, and I told them to record it and to show each other as students what they did as a scenario.
I think what you're talking about is a beautiful illustration of how people really work. And one of the things that happens in architectural practice sometimes is that we diminish the role of the client, and we don't give trust to their non-architect's wisdom, because they have a lot of wisdom. If you take somebody who's not an architect into a city and say, what do you like and what don't you like? The answers are extremely revealing and really helpful. So I often bring what I call surrogate clients into my classes, and we've had juries for housing projects, for example, where all the jurors are people who live in housing and apartments, and they get a chance to respond to what the students are doing. The students, when they have early contact with people who act as clients or with each other pretending to be clients, it's like a geometric explosion of ideas and thinking. There's a notion in architecture that all the ideas we have to come from between our own individual ears. But what you're saying is exactly right. The dialogue is much more explosive in terms of thinking and ideas. We we need to engage people more, and architects do better when we are engaging, much better.
When we listen to people and we see how we observe how they use the space, they are the users of the space that we will create. So they will lead to the success of our projects also if we design them. If they use it more, if they feel comfortable in it, if they talk about it, we reach our goal. And they will talk about this architecture that it suited like what they needed to feel better in the experience of the city and the alignment also
And
of their
science can be a very
senses.
right. So that you feel coherent in a space. You feel well connected. I was going to mention that there is the science can help us out with that. There was a study that was done in New York in the 1960s because there were very expensive parks built in Manhattan called pocket parks because it was a small piece of land, a slice of land. And the idea was that people could leave the intensity of Manhattan's experience and go into a quieter place just for a few minutes or to read, to get off the street. And the pocket parks were not successful. People were not using them. And they would ask the architects, why aren't they working? And the architects didn't have an answer. They thought it was a great design. So the city instead went to a sociologist. And the sociologist then observed how people were using the spaces. He put cameras on the tops of buildings and looked down and looked at different seasons and times of day. And he came to a conclusion that parks that have a place to sit that's at the right height, and if the seats are in the shade in the summer and in the sun in the winter, people will use the park, no matter what else is there. But regardless, if you don't have a seat at that height, it won't be used. And so that information was brought back to the architects. They modified the parks and they became much more successful. So what you're saying is right. It's not just what we think people will do, it's what people really do. And can we have platforms to observe them? And the answer is there's plenty of research now. We know a lot more now than we did 5 years ago, or 10 years, or 20 years ago about how people really experience the world.
Because now we can also quantify the results. So it's not only about what people say. Maybe they will say something that they will say something nice, maybe just to say it, but we can measure what's happening, what's really happening now, and we can confirm if a space is not working properly. And also, there must be this difference between what we design to look at, to admire, like a painting, and what we design to use. So if we want to design something that's beautiful to look at, yes, we can do it, and maybe it's a valid project. But can we use it? Can we use it as people, not just look at it and admire it? So this is a question
Yeah,
that people will ask when they want to design.
it's a very good question. And it starts off, there's a wonderful short film called What Design Can Do that's available online. And it starts by showing pictures of two chairs that you cannot sit in.
Mm.
They're quite beautiful objects. They're wonderful to look at, but they're not possible as seats, as real chairs to use. And it begins the dialogue about how do we find out what people really can use? How do we understand people well enough? I recommend the movie. I think it's a wonderful exposition of basic ideas about how people can be connected to places with wise design. And I'll just mention that my theories or my philosophy of design has gone from problem solving, no matter how detailed, no matter how deep the problem solving is, to wisdom. And I think that we can share our stories about architecture that's successful and inspire other architects to do wise architecture. It's not just how things look, as you say, it's how they feel, how we relate to them, how they help us be better people, or how they prevent us from doing what we want to do.
Mm. Tell us, for example, about a project you designed and the steps you took to reach the goal of your design.
I've done a lot of schools, designed 35 schools.
Mm.
And what emerged as I evolved the way of doing that was reliance on non-architects to make better designs. So a lot of people do a charrette. They meet with people, have an intense day or two session with teachers and students and parents, neighbors to try to get information. But most architects don't have good techniques for getting really good help out of that process. So what I evolved over the years was ways of getting better help from the people I was talking with. And sometimes it was words and sometimes it was images. But what I found was that when I started these programs, these charrettes, I would make two promises to the people who were there. One of them was, I'll get it wrong the first time. I'm
Mhm.
going to hear you. I'm not going to get it right. I promise you I'll come back and you'll correct me. That's the first promise. The second promise is, once I've heard you well, I guarantee that what you want and who you are will be in the design. We won't just be talking around you or meeting your square footage objectives. You will feel at home in the place that we designed because you've been a contributor to the core of it, not just the satellite orbiting around it. That sets the stage for real dialogue because people know at that point they do have a stake in it. They do have the opportunity to influence the outcome. And I find as an architect, some architects are fearful of that because they feel like they'll be told what to do, that someone will express an aesthetic preference and say, I want you to design it in this style. That's not what happens. What happens is that people say what they really want, and architects can build on that with great freedom as designers, but now with a good foundation.
Mm. Now I understand that sometimes the clients cannot understand anymore themselves. When you tell them, tell us your opinion, and it's from my experience, sometimes the clients tend to get confused of what they want. They want something, and then the next day they want something else. And here comes the role of the architect to tell them, okay, you asked for this, and this shape is what leads to this feeling. So here comes the role of the expert in knowing the feeling that can come from the shapes they are designing and the colors and the proportions and the materials and everything else that comes with the design.
Well, you're describing a dialogue. You're describing a way of developing architecture through engaging somebody and asking them questions and showing them ideas and getting responses. That's a respectful process. Unfortunately, architecture has a lot of very famous people who don't respect that process. There's a quote I just saw from Mies van der Rohe, which went something like, um, I tell my clients what they want because they don't know.
Mm.
All right. It's not dialogue. That's a dictatorship of architecture.
That's not very nice.
And it's not very nice. I don't want to be engaged in a practice of architecture like that. I find now the projects that I look back on with real pleasure are the ones where clients were not easy,
Mm,
where they had a challenge that I didn't understand. There was one project that was a school for highly distractible students. They were on the neurodiversity spectrum, and they couldn't succeed in a regular school because they literally couldn't stay at the teaching table for more than a few minutes without needing to get up. And one of the teachers during the course of the dialogue said to me, "I wish this building had bay windows. This is a building that we're going to move into. We were renovating it." Well, of course, there was no budget for adding bay windows, but I didn't know why he felt bay windows would be desirable. And it took 20 minutes of dialogue with this teacher to find out that he thought a bay was a place that you could go to slightly out of the room without really leaving the room. In a sense, it was a place of refuge. Ah, now I understood what he wanted. He wanted a place where these students could get up from the teaching table, go someplace, and recharge themselves. Well, we couldn't do it outside the building. We couldn't add bays, but we found a way geometrically using the lighting to create triangles in the corners of the classroom. And we lowered the ceiling and we put some soft carpet down there and we changed the lighting. And each of them had a window and each of them had plants along the edge so that you could see in and you could see out with some permeability. And nobody had to explain to the students what these were for. When they were at the teaching table and they needed to get up, they went to these, we call them internal bays or areas of repose. They stayed there as long as they needed to, and then they came back to the teaching table. It was maybe the most effective design solution I've ever done. And it's not one that will appear in a magazine because you can't photograph that behavior. But the behavior was life saving. And it made for an outcome that I treasure as an architect as a deep insight into how to help people.
we're talking a lot nowadays about educational institutions. In the previous episode, I discussed this topic also with Dr. Margaret Tarampi. She was talking also about schools, and I had done a presentation. We discussed with her that I had done also a presentation about schools and how they should be designed because it is the foundational place of understanding the spaces and creating a healthy relationship with the space in the future, related to work, related to our houses, to understand where we want to stay, where we want to feel what we want to feel. If you want to feel relaxed, motivated, where to be. For example, schools, I was saying that the future of the design of schools will be totally different if we follow um, how we experience as humans the space, because we're bringing people from so many different backgrounds and we're putting them in the same space to learn. So to develop cognitive, abilities and understand their talents. And so we need this space to have a place to relax, a place for people who are more active, a place for these students to be able to engage, socially engage, or sit a little bit alone to be able to process the emotions when they feel overwhelmed by emotions, because we will have students with traumas, we will have students coming from families that behave in different ways than others. So we cannot just create one way to learn, one way to feel comfortable. There's not something called one way. Okay, we'll have one classroom with different spaces within this classroom.
I agree completely. And I think the greatest expert in that is not an architect, it's a teacher who observes, because teachers will see not just for 5 minutes, but for 5 or 6 months, how students will migrate to the different parts of the classroom when they need to be alone or when they want to engage. Teachers are the great experts for that. And so I spend a lot of time when I'm doing school projects talking to teachers. They have enormous wisdom. But your underlying point, I think, is exactly right. Students are different from each other. They need different environments to learn, and those environments are not static. I may need something in the morning and not need it in the afternoon. So the classroom has to be actually physically a little bigger to accommodate different ways of doing things. And that can get in the way of budget because it does take more square footage to promote diverse experiences in the classroom.
Now, sometimes we can be creative and create something within the space of classroom with colors, with shapes. For example, if we change the shape or the carpet, for example, at one corner with a different lighting, it will create something different. Even because let's not forget that suppose we have people, like you said, like small people, so they will feel
Sure.
the space different. Sure. Yeah, they will feel the space in a different way. They will feel it bigger than what we feel.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would expand that point is to talk about neurodiversity in school design, but also office design and home design. I think if an architect gets to be good enough to design well for neurodiverse students and adults, you can design for anybody. I think that's one of the things that is a great principle. The extremes inform the mean. So if I say I can design for the average person as if there was an average person, which there isn't, that doesn't get you anywhere. Your experience as an architect comes greater if you do this extreme and that extreme, and then you can address all sorts of things. Underlying that, however, there are commonalities. Everybody is different, but not 100% different.
Mm.
People maybe are 10% different or 20% different. Home might have a different kind of definition if it's an office instead of where you sleep. But there's a sense of being at home, of the space being kindred for you and supportive for you.
Mm. Also, maybe some architects will not do what I say because they will say that they don't have time. But what I would do as an architect is when I want to design anything, I will go and experience this concept of, for example, schools. I will go and put myself in these places to understand how it works. So you're saying the teacher knows best about these places. What about if the architect goes a little bit, discovers how the dynamics are in a certain place to be able to design, even if it will take a little bit of more time or of effort, but let's do something with a fruitful result. Something that people will talk about, something that will remain, something that will be an example for other designs in the future.
Right, and collecting those experiences is something that is really important and hard to do. How do I know, Maria, what you've done in school design? I would want to know. There's so many people who have great wisdom and great experience in school design. There are not enough opportunities for me to access that information. I wish there were more. But the other part is actually how designers think. We're talking about what designers should accomplish, but there's also the process of how we think. Um, One of the things that I've read quite a bit about is creativity. And for architects, it can be very delicate. How are we creative? Do we listen to ourselves only? Do we listen to the rest of the world? There's something that has been written a lot about called the pause in the design process. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but the idea is like, you know, Einstein credited daydreaming and dreaming to come up with the theories of relativity. Brahms credited walking in the woods for his symphonies. So we have an office environment where architects are under a lot of pressure to produce designs and do it quickly, but we don't have an opportunity to pause. And without pausing, I think creativity is not really going to happen in the way we want it to. So we have to sort of push with our elbows, push out the office environment to create a space where we can pause. And that's a conundrum. When I talk with practitioners, when I operated my own office, I would encourage people to take breaks. You're looking at your desk and you're clearly frustrated and you're stumped and you don't know what to do. Go take a walk. Go swimming. Do something. The ideas will come to you, and go to bed at night with a problem in your mind and wake up the next morning, you'll have something that will surprise you. Turns out design doesn't have to be as hard as we make it if we open ourselves to other kinds of inspirations and other kinds of influences.
Milton, thank you for this interesting conversation.
My pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking with you. You have a wonderful way of looking at the world, and I really have enjoyed it.
Thank you. And thanks for watching us.